I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the world digests the news from Friday's meeting in the White House between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, we report how the lack of a breakthrough on Tomahawk missiles actually caught some observers by surprise. We ask how relevant the planned meeting in Budapest between Trump and Putin will be, given the widespread acceptance that it's just a continuation of the Kremlin's strategy of stalling for time, and we report on yet another weekend of minimal movement on the ground and yet more Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil and gas facilities.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 20th of October, 3 years and 240 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and later we'll have a pre-record from Professor Robert Persson on how to negotiate with Russia. I started by asking Francis about the political news from Friday's meeting in the White House. Now let's start slightly out of order, slightly unusually. Let's start with the main political news over the weekend from that meeting last Friday. Francis, I saw Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary. She said the US is growing tired of the war. In response to that, former RAF Air Marshal here, Greg Bagwell, said that was a very odd comment, given that it's currently costing the US nothing and the US defence sales are going through the roof. So why was she so aggrieved, and what was the news from Friday?
Thanks, Dom. Quite. Let's begin on a late Friday night in Telegraph Towers, as the long-awaited meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky was delayed, incredibly, while the former entertained Italian opera tenor Andrea Bocelli in the Oval Office. As time to say goodbye was blasting out over the Rose Garden, an ill omen, one might say, Zelensky and his entourage were kept waiting for over half an hour. Then the lunch, attended on the American side by Trump, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff and many others, began with an unscheduled press conference which lasted over 45 minutes on top, forcing Zelensky to fend off difficult questions which can hardly have been a pleasant experience, given it was that exact scenario which triggered the disastrous encounter in February. I was anxious enough just watching it, despite enjoying seeing Connor Stringer of The Telegraph in the press pool standing behind the president and Andriy Yermak. While the atmosphere wasn't exactly unfriendly at that point, it was tense. Zelensky said the US has Tomahawks and other missiles, but they can have thousands of drones. That's where we can work together, and we can strengthen American production. In response, Trump said he hoped to broker a peace deal without having to supply Tomahawks to Kyiv, describing them as escalatory. Now, as soon as we heard that single word, it was obvious to everyone watching there was no chance Trump was about to give those weapons as Kyiv and Europe had hoped, if indeed he ever was. Trump then suggested Zelensky had planted a question with a Ukrainian journalist who said his country needed Tomahawks to match Russia's arsenal of long-range missiles. OK, fair question, exactly as he, pointing at Zelensky, told you to say it, Trump said. He then added it was unlikely Zelensky would be invited to the summit between himself and Putin in Hungary, given the bad blood between the two leaders. Zelensky shot back, saying he was ready to come face-to-face with Putin in any format. Clearly, the business opportunities for the US Putin had dangled during his emergency call with Trump last week struck a chord. Trump suggested he would look at plans floated by a senior Kremlin official to create a 70-mile undersea tunnel connecting Russia with the US state of Alaska. "What do you think of that, Mr. President?" he said to Zelensky. "How do you like that idea?" "I'm not happy with this," Zelensky replied. Once again, as has become custom, Zelensky's choice of outfit was also commented upon. This time it was a suit-like black military jacket, which Trump called stylish. But that wasn't the only wardrobe-related issue. Secretary of War Hegseth was accused of deliberately wearing a pro-Russian tie, something that TASS, the Russian state-owned news agency, leapt on, saying, Hegseth's tie, featuring bold white, blue and red stripes arranged in the same order as the Russian national flag, stood out among the otherwise restrained attire of the US delegation. Putin's economic envoy also shared it on X, and J.D. Vance responded, or maybe he was wearing the colours of America. Now, it may all seem rather silly, this, but even if it is true what Vance says, many would argue it does speak to a diplomatic insensitivity of Trump's top team at this delicate moment. But all this preamble pales in significance to what we now know took place afterwards, where it seems that the call from Putin was enough to throw out several months of stronger US posturing on Ukraine. As the Financial Times report, after the journalists left the room, Trump urged Zelensky to accept Russia's terms for ending the war, warning him that Putin would destroy Ukraine if he didn't agree. Apparently, the meeting was a shouting match, with Trump cursing all the time. He even threw aside Ukrainian maps of the battlefield and pressured Zelensky to surrender Donetsk to Russia, that crucial land which makes up part of the fortress belt of heavily defended towns that block Russia from making rapid westward advances towards the capital. Trump then went on to echo Putin's talking points. Despite them contradicting his own recent assessment, Moscow was a paper tiger. He told Zelensky he was losing the war, and then, supported by envoy Steve Witkoff, was urged to give up vast portions of the east. Witkoff claimed that that region, as well as Luhansk, had a significant Russian-speaking population. Even now, that talking point is impossible to shift among the White House delegation. A European diplomat afterwards told the Washington Post that Ukraine would never accept such a deal. It's like selling Russia their own leg in exchange for nothing, he said. Another told us at the Telegraph, we were expecting Tomahawks, and now we're back at the beginning. Now, I know many of you, like us, are frustrated with the media obsession with Trump's position on this war. It's a circus, frankly. But that last quote speaks to why we have to be as journalists, because Europe is. Europe is obsessed with what Washington says and does. Now, I'll return to the continent's reaction later, but it is clear the optimism in European capitals that they had finally succeeded in shifting President Trump's view of the war and convinced him that Moscow might be playing him were widely misplaced. A single call from Putin can upend everything. He's simply not reliable, something that should be obvious by now. I spoke to former NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg yesterday in an interview you'll hear over the coming days, and he was unequivocal that Russia would only stop once it is compelled to. And if that is true, then given that the US must be regarded at best as a neutral actor now, with anything more being considered a bonus, it falls to the continent to change the calculus. As we've been saying for months, it is your move, Europe. The world and Ukraine is waiting. But there's no sign yet they've got the message, Dom.
Thanks, Francis. If I may, just been scribbling some notes here while you were talking. My reaction to this. Number one, Hegseth's tie. I couldn't care less about his tie. Was it a subliminal message? I just don't care. I don't think it was. I think he's just wearing a tie. He probably quite likes that tie. I don't know. Ridiculous. Secondly, this idea of a breakthrough. Is this going to be a breakthrough? Tomahawks, all the rest of it. I think those commentators saw this as that it was going to be a breakthrough. I mean, the fact that Zelensky came away without Tomahawks, I hear, has even caught some analysts by surprise. I don't think anybody really should have been surprised by that. To be honest, I thought Donald Trump was going to play out the Tomahawk thing for a bit longer as a possible bargaining chip for both sides. I didn't think he was so unequivocally going to shut it down, but I don't honestly think there was ever any chance that Ukraine were going to get the hardware. And as for that European official saying, oh my God, we were expecting the Tomahawks, well, he or she shouldn't be drawing their cash, because that's ridiculous. Or if you were expecting it, if you're a diplomat, you shouldn't expect anything that you haven't already laid up backstage. And these big public events are just there to seal the deal. You shouldn't expect something that you don't know is coming down the tracks. I think any European optimism was just born of panic and laziness, quite frankly. They want America to come riding to the rescue again because they just can't or won't get themselves in gear. And finally, this comment, and I'm going to disagree with you here, Francis. When you say Trump isn't reliable, he is totally reliable. He's been reliable since he's been in power the second time. He is reliable. You know what you're going to get with him. There's some noise in the margins and a bit of veering and hauling. He shows a bit of ankle every now and again to make some people want Ukraine to win the war go, he's changed. It's brilliant. Trump's changed. He's not changed. He is reliable in his position and fine. So you plan for that. And I'll just point you to comments by Michael Weiss, who's from The Insider, who said his advice for Ukraine is act as if you're on your own and take all evidence to the contrary as a pleasant surprise. And I think that's how we should view Trump now. OK, enough of that. We'll come back to you shortly for the other diplomatic updates, of which there were quite a few over the weekend. But let's go on to the military updates. Again, another weekend, yet more days, characterised by continued Ukrainian attacks against Russian oil and gas facilities and no real move on the ground, except, and I need to draw your attention to Kupiansk in the northeast of the country. Further push over the weekend by Russia towards, and in some areas, reaching the city centre. So it's not a uniform movement there by Russia. There's urban fighting, but they are progressing towards, and in some cases into, the city centre of Kupiansk. But generally no particular move on the ground. However, we are told to expect an imminent Russian breakthrough in the Kherson region. So Vladimir Saldo, who's been installed down there by the Kremlin as governor of Kherson Oblast, he's been especially bullish over the weekend. He was claiming yesterday that Russian forces control an industrial area on the east bank, the left bank of the Dnieper River. Remember, we talk about rivers by the direction they're flowing. So the left bank, in this case, is that eastern bank. He said that Russia has taken control of an industrial area on the left bank and several areas of open country near the Dnieper River Delta Islands. He said, with no sense of irony whatsoever, because as we know, Russians can't do irony, he said the seizure of Kherson city itself has already begun. Now, you'll remember Russian forces withdrew from all of the west bank of Kherson Oblast in November 22 and have since then basically relied on the so-called drone safari, whereby civilians are murdered at random by drone in order to terrorise the city and terrorise Ukrainian society. That tactic been employed, I think, over the weekend in Pokrovsk, according to some social media footage I've been looking at this morning. Anyway, let's go back over the weekend. Friday evening, there was a powerful explosion in one of the workshops of the avant-garde enterprise in Stelichimak. That's in Russia's Republic of Bashkortostan. That's about 1,200 kilometres east-southeast of Moscow, a long way away from Ukraine. That place, we are told, produces gunpowder and ammunition for Russia. The report said that at least 8 people were injured. The reasons for that blast are unknown. I have seen various reports claiming that a safety violation there rather than a Ukrainian strike were to blame, but we don't really know. Overnight, Friday, Saturday, Ukraine was hit across the country, mainly in the centre and the east. The Ukrainian military shot down 136 of 164 Russian drones, but the others got through, and 3 S-300 missiles also got through air defence. S-300, typically an air defence missile, but has been here re-employed by Russia in a ground attack role, for which it's not designed, and therefore it doesn't have any of the accuracy it has in its primary role. Then overnight, Saturday, Sunday, Russia's Novokibichevsk oil refinery was hit. That was a Ukrainian drone attack, large fire and plumes of smoke seen over the refinery's oil storage tanks there after the attack. That was in Samara, about 1,000 kilometres southeast of Moscow. The same night, Saturday, Sunday, drones attacked the Orenburg gas processing plant. That's about 1,000 kilometres southeast of Moscow. It's down on the border with Kazakhstan. Ukraine's general staff said the plant is one of Russia's largest natural gas processing complexes, processing up to 45 billion cubic metres of natural gas and 6.2 million tonnes of gas condensate and oil per year. Now, I mention those statistics because I haven't got a clue what they mean. They are in the report, so we report them to you. And anyone who works in this sector, please let us know if that's a great big hill of beans or a small strike. Equally, when the Kazakhstan Ministry of Energy said on Sunday that the drone strike had caused the Orenburg gas processing plant to temporarily stop receiving gas from Kazakhstan's Karachaganak oil and gas project, again, I don't know if that's a big deal, but if you do, please do let us know. It's worth adding that I've seen reports just in the last hour that Orenburg plant, the gas processing plant, has been hit again this morning. Now then, Sunday, 60 drones fired by Russia at Ukraine, 40 of them shot down. Also, Russia launched a large-scale attack against a coal mine in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It briefly trapped 192 miners underground. This comes from Ukraine's energy company DTEK reporting. They say it's the fourth large-scale attack on DTEK coal enterprises over the past 2 months, obviously continuing Russia's attack against Ukraine's energy sector ahead of winter. Now, the miners were brought to the surface safely. No one was injured, but the attack did go ahead. I don't know what impact it's had on production there. Also on Sunday, Finnish President Alexander Stubb authorised his country's 30th military aid package to Ukraine worth 52 million euros. That brings the total Finnish support to just under 3 billion euro. His website reported that on Sunday. At the same time, Slovakia said they were going to provide 500 million euro in energy equipment and another 300 million for school shelters. That comes after a meeting between the Ukrainian and Slovakian foreign ministers. Now, last night, an attack by Russia in the north of Ukraine in the Chernihiv region has left 50,000 without power after another strike on the energy infrastructure. Officials this morning said a very significant damage occurred at the facility in Koryakivka. That's about 50 k's northeast of Chernihiv. And late hours last night, early hours this morning, Russian forces launched a maritime drone attack on the port of Yuzhny on the south coast of Ukraine, just up about 30 or 40 k's northeast up the coast from Odessa. Air raid sirens were sounded just before midnight last night, local time, and the maritime risk management firm Ombre Intelligence say they had seen uncorroborated footage of the attack. They say large explosions had been observed with large plumes of fire and smoke rising from the impact. Now, they report Russian forces-affiliated media as saying that attack targeted military cargo that had arrived from Romania. No way of us verifying that. And at the time of the attack, Ombre say that no merchant vessels were observed in the area, but they do say that many maritime merchant vessels hold their AIS signals, the automatic identification signals, so you can't see them bleeping, basically, whilst transiting the Black Sea and making port calls. And just finally this morning, back from Washington, President Zelensky speaking to journalists in Kyiv, he said that Ukraine, on the sidelines of Friday, looks like they may have achieved a deal to buy 25 more Patriot air defence systems from the United States. Right, Franco, what else have you got on the diplomatic front?
Thanks. So let me pick up with the reaction to that meeting in the White House. Zelensky, for obvious reasons, had to get his messaging out early. He was unequivocal. We will give nothing to Russia and forget nothing. I instructed our diplomats, he said, and we have already spoken about this with many leaders, to prepare a meeting of the coalition of the willing in the near future. We need strong joint positions in Europe, and this will happen, he said. One can almost sense the panic in that message. And no wonder. In a social media post published directly after his meeting with Zelensky, Trump wrote that Kyiv and Moscow should make a deal with the property lines being defined by war and guts. Many are reading that as meaning that land seized by Russia in the war is somehow earned. A blatant violation of international law. Now, the Europeans had a call with Zelensky after that meeting. Merz afterwards, of Germany, wrote this. Following his meeting with President Trump, we have coordinated and will accompany the next steps. What Ukraine needs now is a peace plan. He admitted the meeting had not gone as well as hoped, which is certainly an understatement, I would say. No doubt many of the European leaders are regretting not accompanying Zelensky as they did at that White House meeting after the Alaska summit. From now on, that may have to be the default.
Don't go back. Why do you go back? Let your officials and the administrative channels of state speak to the US administration. President Zelensky Don't go back to the White House. You know what's going to happen.
I hear you. But given the leverage the US still has, if they invite President Zelensky to the White House, as they did this time, realistically, can Kyiv say no? This is one of the problems of the present moment. Europe not having a strong position and, in a way, strong strategic stake in this war in terms of their actions. Of course, they do it incentive, but in terms of their actions, means that still the key definers of the direction of travel are arguably Moscow and Washington. It's an absurd position to still be in at this point, but I think that's where we are. And listen to this as another example of the concern in Europe, this time by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. After President Zelensky's talks in the White House and with European leaders, one thing is absolutely clear. Europe's solidarity with Ukraine against Russia's aggression is today more important than ever before. Now, just as a slight tangent, since I mentioned Poland, that Ukrainian national suspected of blowing up Nord Stream 2, he was supposed to be extradited to Germany from Poland. That's now been blocked by Warsaw. And rightly so, said Tusk. The case is closed. Now, fundamentally, Europe's failure to be the determinant factor in the outcome of this war is coming home to roost yet again. There is obviously a real crisis of leadership, with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer seeking to act as a mediator between Kyiv and Washington, President Macron beleaguered at home, as Adley was talking about last week, and Chancellor Merz impeded by his coalition partners. But Europe may soon have no choice but to do something bold. And I know I sound like a broken record on this, but given the fundamental importance of Ukraine for the continent's security, and it's seeking to end the war soon, it has no choice. It has no choice. Now, in other news, just to wrap up, tempting though it is for something a bit lighter and to focus on those jewels of Napoleon that were stolen from the Louvre over the weekend, I want to end with two stories. The first is that the Dutch intelligence services are no longer sharing everything with the United States, a confirmation of what was widely speculated given Trump's appointments and statements, but until now had not been officially confirmed. Simply put, America's allies simply no longer trust her completely. The directors of the two services told Volkskrant in a joint interview that their caution is linked to what they describe as increasingly autocratic courses of President Trump. That we sometimes don't tell things anymore, that is true. We are very alert to the politicisation of intelligence and to human rights violations, they told the paper. Now, the other story follows the extraordinary protest in St. Petersburg we reported last week, where a crowd was singing a song widely interpreted as being about the death of Putin. We knew there would be ramifications, and so it has proved. The teenager who led the crowd's chants has been arrested and jailed. Street musician Diana Loganova, just 18 years old, was sentenced to 13 days in prison. The footage of her being led into court in handcuffs is horrible to watch. Her anxiety is obvious. And no wonder. It was possible she'd face years behind bars. I think it could have been as many as 12. Such is the reality of modern Russia, which has become, as we've talked about so much, increasingly despotic, yet which finds itself welcomed back into the international community, particularly after Alaska and now after the Hungary summit that we can expect in perhaps a couple of weeks' time. Europe, as I was saying earlier on, it's your call. You have to do more if you want to change this. But where are they?
Let's turn to our interview now. Back in February, Francis spoke to Professor Robert Persson, non-resident senior fellow in the Eurasian programme at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and author of several papers on the likelihood of a breakthrough in negotiations between Kyiv and Moscow. Now, several months on, as Trump seeks to use the momentum of the Gaza ceasefire to try and force a conclusion to the war in Ukraine, Francis speaks to him again for his analysis on the feasibility of progress. This is their conversation.
Well, Robert, pleasure to have you back on the podcast. The last time we spoke was back in February, and we had quite a far-reaching conversation, but I hope I'm not unjustly summarising it by saying that you were very sceptical as to the likelihood of Donald Trump making masses of progress in negotiations relating to the war in Ukraine as we move into this next phase. And when reflecting on that, how much do you think has changed in the months that have taken place since we spoke in February?
Sure. Well, thanks, Francis. It's wonderful to be back with you and back with the Ukraine the Latest team. You guys do such great service in keeping this conflict and the many facets of it really front and center where it needs to be. You know, I seem to recall back in February noting that this was one case where I really wanted to be proven wrong. I wanted my skepticism to be unfounded, and I wanted progress for a peace settlement. Unfortunately, I think that I've been proven right and that we haven't seen meaningful progress towards peace. Not for lack of effort. I think President Trump and his people, certainly did invest time and attention and efforts into trying to find a settlement. And of course, I think President Zelensky and the Ukrainians demonstrated a good faith willingness to sit down, to talk, to be realistic about what is and is not possible for Ukraine to achieve. But as I knew back in February, as we've known now for 3.5 years, the real barrier is Russia and fundamentally Putin's inflexible and ultimately maximalist war aims. So back then when we spoke, the gist of the argument was sort of 3 key conditions tend to prevent peaceful diplomatic settlements of conflicts. One of those is indivisibility of what they're fighting over. And here the problem is that Putin, since day one, has been fighting for the elimination of an independent Ukrainian state, a free Ukrainian democracy, and indeed the existence of the Ukrainian people as a unique nationality. And that really hasn't changed. And that's not something that can be bargained away, through territory or other sort of policy agreements. And so, time and time again, even though we have seen diplomatic activity, we've really not seen any fundamental change either to the Russian position or to ultimately Putin's willingness to alter his behavior on the battlefield in order to signal any kind of good faith openness to negotiating. And where I see that perhaps most prominently, think back to what has happened over the last few months. If we think back to the summer, there was this whole flurry of activity. And, what happened after that, really nothing in terms of change in Russia's behavior. They didn't even bother sort of the usual routine of, saying, yes, we agree, we understand, and, we will explore the technical details. And, normally they go through this elaborate play, these theatrics of extending out talks to draw it out. They didn't really even bother with that this time. Within a couple of days of the Washington summit that brought Zelensky and all the European leaders to the United States after the Alaska summit, Russia was back to bombing civilian apartment blocks with devastating effect. So to me, all of that flurry and all of the hope that at least a ceasefire might come of it really didn't produce any changes in Russia's behavior. And so I think that illustrates so powerfully that still Putin has no desire to find an off-ramp to this war.
Everything has changed and yet nothing has changed. Or do you think we're going to be stuck in this frozen cycle for a very, very long time?
So we do know that President Trump is keenly interested in achieving a diplomatic breakthrough. I think he very much wants to have that beautiful signing ceremony like the one he just had in the Middle East, hailing the Gaza ceasefire. He has shown a willingness over the last several months to re-engage diplomatically with Russia. And so I think, one of the consequences coming now out of the Gaza success, which certainly is a remarkable achievement and certainly a positive development. I think the possibility is that in seeking to re-engage diplomatically for the sake of what I consider to be an ultimately impossible diplomatic settlement, that we are potentially opening the risk of just extending the usual game where Russia will say things, they'll make promises, they'll say the right words, not back it up by action, but will at least give the impression to the administration that they are engaging. And what potentially could happen then is that we sort of take the foot off the gas when it comes to the things that really will pressure Russia. And so that's, I think, one of the things that's been on my mind since the ceasefire in Gaza.
When it comes to that toolkit that you referenced there, Robert, of things that the administration could do, what ones immediately jump to mind for you as being the most pivotal for trying to shift the dial in a really speedy way? Because many of the tools would take months, possibly even longer than that. So if they were serious about this and saying, right, we've solved one, we want to do the next one very quickly, what would they need to do tomorrow or next week to really ramp up the pressure on the Russians, do you think?
I don't think there will ever be a signing ceremony of any piece of paper settling this conflict, certainly not for the foreseeable future. And so I am skeptical that there is really any reasonable coercive pressure or measures that the United States or our allies in Europe could bring against Russia in order to get them to say, you know what, it is finally time to find a way out of this dead end. And so I have always maintained that the quote unquote settlement of this war will happen on the battlefield, one way or another. Now, obviously, the battlefield, as you guys so well know and cover, extends far beyond just the front line of contact, wherever that may be at the moment. But ultimately, I still see the most likely long-term, I hesitate to even say settlement of the war, but I think the most likely long-term outcome is a situation where the battle lines essentially become frozen thanks to significant Ukrainian defenses and the support of Ukraine to make the cost of Russian advances, Russian offensive action, just impossibly high. And so those are the types of measures that I think we need to be supporting if we want to at least achieve a frozen conflict, a stabilized conflict. And so significantly increasing, our support and our aid and ability for Ukraine to withstand Russian attacks, to defend against Russian attacks. But I also think that, of course, one of the most significant developments of the last several months has been the extraordinary effect that Ukraine has had. I was about to say on their own. We now know that it's not on their own, but their attacks on Russia's oil refineries and some of their other export infrastructure, I think, has emerged as a significant point of pain for Russia. And so that is a direction that I think Ukraine will certainly pursue. Western facilitation of those efforts, again, could also significantly raise the pain point on Putin, but probably not enough, again, to convince him to come to the table. If there is one international actor that actually has the leverage to do that, to pick up the phone and say, Volodya, it's time to bring this to an end, that, of course, would be China. And I certainly have seen no evidence that China has any willingness or interest in applying that kind of pressure on Putin in order to really force him to bring this thing to an end.
Well, I'm glad you brought up China, because that was going to be my next question. As you say, they are an absolutely pivotal player in this war. And there are some who argue, particularly in the intelligence world, that there's almost some sort of deal that's been struck between Beijing and Moscow that says just keep up the fight and we will bail you out, as it were, because of the distraction that it causes to Europe, the distraction that it causes to the United States. And it means that not all eyes are on China. and that for them that is worth the price, the diplomatic flack, as well as the literal economic cost of bailing Russia out on certain levels. So do you see there being any prospect of pressure being brought on China to compel them to change direction in the way that you've just articulated, Robert?
Sadly, and you're probably going to get tired of hearing this from me, my gut answer is no. Just look at the current set of, shall we say, diplomatic challenges between the United States and China at the moment. We've seen a recent sort of reignition or escalation of the trade war between Beijing and Washington. China's announcement that they would put significant restrictions on the export and the use of rare earth minerals and associated technologies. That is, frankly, a significant point of leverage for the Chinese. And it's something that Washington will absolutely have to contend with in that bilateral relationship. And so here we have a situation where you have sort of rising hostility, or at least rising tensions, shall we say, between Beijing and Washington. And we've got an issue where China does have some rather significant economic leverage over the United States in a field that has tremendous defense and national security implications. So when I think of what is the leverage that the United States could bring to bear independently on China to then influence, I don't know of that lever, I don't know of that stick or that carrot, frankly.
We haven't talked very much about Europe, which perhaps is revealing in and of itself, frankly, at the present moment. What's your assessment of Europe's direction of travel in the last few months? I mean, they have managed to keep the worst case scenarios involving a United States withdrawal away for now, perhaps permanently. I mean, that would be, of course, an enormous success. But it doesn't feel like they are fulfilling the role that many of us hoped that they would. Is that fair? Is that your assessment as well as we enter this next phase?
So I will acknowledge your sunny optimism, characteristically, insofar as, yes, we have avoided sort of the worst case scenario. And I think even back in February when we spoke, and in an article that I published back in January in the Journal of Democracy that lays out the argument more fully, I said the worst case scenario is for the West, led by the United States, to just completely pull the rug out on Ukraine. And luckily, that has not happened. The United States obviously sort of drew down its direct military aid and assistance. And after that brief pause in intelligence sharing, that has been restored. And yes, Europe has certainly stepped up to fill some of the gap. And I do think that the Trump administration's willingness to allow Europe to buy American weapons from Ukraine is a positive development. Let's be honest, there are those in the United States who would argue that we shouldn't be selling weapons that will end up in Ukraine because we need to be stockpiling those for a potential conflict in the Pacific region. So the fact that, at least for now, Europe is allowed to buy these weapons and commit them to Ukrainian defense, I think is possible. But as you note, looking sort of beyond the horizon or at least into the future, there are some distressing signs, of course. You guys have covered sort of the new plan to potentially use Russian frozen assets in a more direct manner than they have been before. And I was
direct, but still rather
more direct.
legally complex, shall we say?
Yeah. Maybe direct isn't the right word. Up till now, they've been able to use the interest that has been accruing on those assets to aid Ukraine. As I understand the new plan, it involves a loan drawn against those assets that only gets repaid in the event that Russia pays reparations to Ukraine to repay the loan, and so on and so forth. Of course, as I understand it, though, that requires within the European Union a longer term authority than the current renewal requirement every 6 months. And so that is, I think, a nut that Europe has to crack. All the more difficult now. I've heard that I believe it was the Austrians have expressed some skepticism about their willingness to go along with that. And then you've got sort of the perpetual problem children of Hungary and Slovakia that have always sort of suggested sort of every 6 months when the broader sanctions packages come up for discussion and renewal, there is always a threat that they could finally sort of withdraw their consent. And so that obviously sort of limits the ability of Europe to signal a credible commitment both to Ukraine and, more importantly, to Putin, that they are in it for the long haul. And then the last thing on the European question that always does worry me, both from a policy perspective and from a normative perspective, is the sword is always dangling with the possibility of, far-right parties that could come to power and wield significant veto authority in some European countries. And again, we know that many of those parties and many of their supporters seem to be sympathetic to the Russian position, the Russian talking points. And so every time there are parliamentary and presidential elections in certain European countries, I do hold my breath, because those could have significant implications on the unity of Europe when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, with that veto power, you, in a sense, are only as strong as your weakest link, unless you then try and operate outside of those structures. But then you think, well, what's the point in having those structures in the first place? It's just more bureaucracy. And I think this is going to be a theme. It already is, but I think this is going to be a theme thinking many years ahead, as well as global threats increase, because it just does feel that this current state, because of the risks you've just highlighted, it's unsustainable. It's simply unsustainable.
Yeah. And sorry to interrupt. I wanted to jump in there and note that, again, we know that the Kremlin actively intervenes, actively manipulates through its entire toolkit of political warfare, information warfare, hybrid warfare, call it what you want. We know that they are attempting to influence those democratic elections in Europe, because they know very well the gains that they would get if some of those parties were elected. And so, again, sort of defending democracy, I think, is also a critical, if rarely acknowledged, national security imperative, frankly, for all free countries, but certainly those that are under active threat in, what I see as a 20-year Russian war against democracy.
Well, sobering analysis, Robert, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm aware that we haven't got too much time left. I was going to throw a thought out and then I'll give you the floor for any thoughts that we've not discussed. And that is, in a way, you've painted a picture, and one that I wholeheartedly agree with, I should say, that we are, as it were, in a predictable path of it being rather unlikely to see a massive breakthrough on the negotiations front for some time. Of course, we both love to be wrong, nothing more than to love to be wrong, but it does feel like we're dealing with misunderstandings about the Russian position still in key capitals, and until that shift takes place and they wake up, as it were, that things aren't going to move. But I throw out there this, which is, history doesn't operate on these entirely predictable paths, as we both know. There are often black swan events that can occur that change everything. And I wonder, perhaps just as a intellectual parlor game, as it were, if we could just wonder what kind of black swan events, which aren't, impossible to predict. I mean, no black swan event is ever impossible to predict, could change things completely in a way that might lead to profound shifts.
Boy, that's a really compelling question. It's a tricky one because obviously, sort of the more creative fiction writers, of which I'm not one, certainly could have a field day thinking what if and what could happen. I will simply state the most obvious, which is that Vladimir Putin's unexpected exit from the earth probably would be the event that is singly most likely to fundamentally sort of change the dynamics of the conflict. Now, that's obviously not advocating in any way or form that the West should sort of actively facilitate that outcome. But, he's 73 years old and appears to be in good health, but there are always surprises possibly. And the reason I think that is the most likely of the game-changing black swan events that I can imagine is that I really do think that much of this war, while premised on a foundation of some very deep and enduring imperial Russian ambitions that are shared far more widely than just Putin and which reach farther back in history than just his many decades in rule. I think that so much of this conflict is being driven by his personal beliefs and his obsession with solving the Ukraine problem. And of course, in a highly personalized, centralized autocratic system like his, the dictator has overwhelming say in the direction of the country. So that's the only one that I can imagine. But, I generally try not to engage in the Kremlinology or the reading of the tea leaves of sort of saying, well, boy, his right leg seemed a little stiff today. That's clearly signs that he is about to die. In the meantime, I think the wisest strategy is sort of not to hope for the best, but to implement strategically informed, consistent policies to achieve the outcome that we want. And from where I sit, I think the best way to do that is to clearly signal both the West's commitment, not just to stay in as long as it takes, to repeat sort of a tired old setting, but to sort of establish some clear strategic objectives and signal both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians that our commitment is enduring and that we are willing to sort of see this to the end.
Well said, Robert. Is there anything that we've not talked about that you'd just like to raise with listeners before you go?
I'll simply maybe mention that we will certainly see a lot of diplomatic activity in the weeks to come. I think now that we've got a ceasefire in Gaza, and I certainly hope that ceasefire is stable, and I hope that is the foundation of a durable and lasting peace agreement. So assuming that sort of powder keg holds steady, I think we'll see a lot of activity and attention now shifting towards the war in Ukraine. That can be a double-edged sword. Greater attention, I think, always means that there's more energy and more sort of creativity in finding new ways to achieve our strategic objectives. But the risk is that we sort of fall back into this cycle of pinning hopes to sort of every positive development, every potential that may pop up in the news cycle. And the fundamental reality, as you and I have discussed before, is there are no game changers. There are no silver bullets. There's not a summit or a visit that is all of a sudden going to bring to an end this incredibly complex conflict. And so as consumers of media, we sort of need to be level-headed. I think the media probably needs to be a little bit more realistic in how they cover these types of events, but certainly policymakers need to understand that sort of the fundamental intransigent problem remains, and that is the Russian position embodied by Vladimir Putin.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure that we will have you back on again. And let's hope that the next time we do, there has been some progress. But for all of the reasons you've articulated, I think we have to be rather cautious in assuming that will be the case. But thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys.
Right, we'll do final thoughts. So, my final thoughts, I would point you to an article in this week's Economist. I'm going to put a link in the episode notes. The article is headlined, Ukraine's most prestigious military units are run like businesses. And they look at 3 elite units, the Hatir, Azov, and what they call the Third Assault, which I think they mean the Third Separate Assault Brigade, although they've grown, all of them have grown since they were first created. The Economist says they look, in fact, very much like political ads, and that is surely no accident. The ads for these, the recruitment ads for these units, is a really interesting exploration of how different units are recruiting and training their own people, and increasingly being seen as potential power bases for political manoeuvrings after the war. So do have a look at that. We'll put the, like I say, the link in the episode notes. We speak to some of these people. We are speaking to them as well. It's very, very tricky, when they're in the middle of a fight. So when you say, you're only doing this for future political gain, that's a shortcut to getting yourself kicked out of the interview. So we do try and pose these questions, but it's a good one there from the Economist. Have a look at that, and we'll be taking some of these points up with our contacts. Francis, what's your final thoughts?
Just a very quick one from me. The EU Council has just agreed to fully ban Russian gas imports by 2028. Leaders are saying it sends an unequivocal message. Aggressors have no place in Europe's energy market. But 2028, I mean, given the urgency of the situation, is that really good enough?
Where's the unequivocal quote come from?
I believe that is from Estonia.
Okay. Saying it's an unequivocal... I mean, it certainly is unequivocal about EU not taking it seriously, I might venture. It's easy to say it here, I know, but I agree. 2028, come on.
You might think that, Dom. I couldn't possibly comment.
You just did. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.